just lost the initiative.
That's your new target, unless it's not big enough.
Launch countermeasures.
Have you ever said, "This makes no sense," and someone tells you, "You're just not seeing it right"? Well, how do you know? You gotta know where to look and trust your own eyes. There are clues, even a template. Hello, I'm Lewis, and this is the Red Pill Diary. Come on in and join us. I've switched the lights on for you. It was a cloudy, hot, and humid night, not unusual for this tropical season and equatorial climate. The small group of men stood looking east at the seemingly sudden appearance of lights of the imposing, nearly 4,800 gross tonnage, 367-foot Swedish freighter on the horizon. Despite the empty dock, they spoke in hushed voices, conferring and directing the leader of the men selected to offload the precious cargo in a few hours. However, even with the closure of the small port town, a lone observer slipped away unnoticed as the freighter nudged up to the dock and they began offloading Alfheim's cargo onto the awaiting rail cars. The two men dressed in jungle camouflage worked quickly. The dampness and the heat slowed their progress, but not their determination. As they made their way through the trusses, their packages secured to their knapsacks. It was getting dark, which could create another obstacle for their completion of their project. The train will be approaching soon. They secured the packages and prepared the fuses as they felt a vibration in the rails. At that precise moment, they lit the fuse and quickly climbed up the truss, over the tracks, and into the jungle to the other men awaiting. They waited, anticipating a large explosion as the train struggled along, carrying a string of heavily loaded boxcars. The men heard the loud crack. It echoed through the jungle and the ravine below, and then the downpour as the train began to cross. They waited and watched, hoping, but there was no explosion. The train continued unhindered. The solitary man who slipped away from the dock earlier that day quickly arose and spoke on the radio and waited for the response and the eruption of gunfire that followed. It was May 28, 1954. Let's set the stage. We've got to start with 2 points. Basically the base of this. I'll loosely title the first one legal and the other one I'll call moral. Now that's my framing, nothing official. It's just my framing of it. There are others, but these two will give us some sort of a context to the edge of this episode. We have to go back to December 2nd, 1823. We're just going to go briefly, but here's the first point. President James Monroe, in his foreign policy position that he articulated to the annual report to Congress, and we know it as the Monroe Doctrine, in my nutshell, quote unquote, essentially he's speaking for the U.S. in that he warned the European powers against further colonialization in Latin America. It was a position that opposed European colonialism and essentially all foreign powers in the Western Hemisphere. It held that, or still does to some extent, any intervention in the political affairs of the Americas by foreign powers is a potentially hostile act against the United States. Why? Because the Western Hemisphere was within the U.S. sphere of influence. Now, jump forward to 1840s. You have President James Polk, the 11th president, and he used the term manifest destiny. I'm sure you've heard that before. And he argued European powers shouldn't interfere with projected territorial expansion. Now, that would deal with the West Coast, Oregon, during that period of time. Grover Cleveland, who happened to be the 22nd and 24th president into the 19th century, he wrapped it up essentially implying that the Americans had a national interest in any matter of substance within the hemisphere. Forward that to Teddy Roosevelt, and he added what was called the Roosevelt Corollary, and this was in 1904. He essentially asserted kind of a police power or a moral imperative that in cases of flagrant and chronic wrongdoing by a Latin American country, now that's a pretty broad and vague terms, the United States could intervene in that country's internal affairs. So Roosevelt and others used this aggressive interpretation going forward to intervene throughout Central America in what they would term or define as flagrant and chronic wrongdoing, which continued with multiple U.S. interventions, and including, in this case, Guatemala. Now let's jump to the 20th century. Now we're going to talk about the second point, this moral point. Before we start, we need to put this in a box. When someone uses the term Red Scare, that's really kind of defined as a moral panic or a supposed rise, real or perceived, of these influencing left ideology, especially communism. And essentially, it refers to two real distinct periods of time. The first Red Scare was between 1917 and 1920, which occurred immediately after World War I. It revolved around a perceived threat from, the American labor movement, anarchist revolution, political radicalism, kind of followed the social movements in Germany and Russia during the 19th and early 20th century. So the Bolshevik Revolution, you've got fascism, you've got all these things going on. That would be within that time frame. Now, the second Red Scare was between 1947 and 1957, which occurred immediately after World War II, which was preoccupied with the perception, real or perceived, that national or foreign communists were infiltrating or subverting American society and the federal government. Now, you'll also hear the phrase for national security interests or interests in national security. That phrase gets used in order to justify some intervention somewhere in the world based on that premise that we have a duty or an obligation or a legal right to intervene because it affects that being the United States, national interest. That's a very broad term that's used to justify a lot of conduct, rightly or wrong, but it is what they use. So you can see that the government has interacted or intervened. In this case, in the 1950s, we're going to see our government intervenes in Central America. And in this case, in 1950, right after the coup d'etat in Iran, now we see them intervening in Central America in Guatemala. So now that we have the base set, now we need to work on some background about Guatemala and the players and the cast of characters that we've got in this. And these names are going to be familiar because you have heard them before. And you will hear them again in future episodes, especially around the turn of the 19th century. There will be others that pop up that are either related to these individuals, like I keep saying over and over again, or they are involved in same or similar kinds of conduct or behavior as these individuals here. So you ask, why is this important? Well, it's because this type of behavior that repeats itself, or at least rhymes, you can then see or ask the question, is this happening here and in now? And this is going to show up when we get farther along in this episode, because we're going to get to a point where we're going to stop and we're going to analyze this conduct. And then we're going to say, how did it get there? And what are they doing now? Or have they done it again? That's the kind of questions we want to ask. And that's the whole point. Now, a little background on Guatemala. In 1931 to 1944, Jorge Ubico was the president of Guatemala. He was elected, but he was the only candidate. He was a general in the Guatemalan army. He continued his predecessor's policy of giving massive concessions to the United Fruit Company and wealthy landowners. He basically supported their harsh labor policies. He was described, or has been described, as one of the most oppressive tyrants Guatemala has ever known, who actually compared himself to Adolf Hitler. He was removed by this pro-democracy uprising in 1944, which led to the 10-year Guatemalan Revolution. I want to point out that the United States government has taken no action against this particular individual. That's important going forward to contrast in 1944 versus 1954 and the conduct of the United States getting involved in Guatemala and the very reason why, or arguably one of the major reasons why, they got involved at all. This is why the first 3 points in this episode is very important. Think about the person that's currently in the presidency and the three things: Monroe Doctrine, moral imperative, and Red Scare. And you ask yourself, would this person be a candidate for those three base points? So what's the point? Well, the point is, look at the condition of Guatemala at the time of 1944 to 1950, and the United States government makes no intervention. Just 4 years later, when a democratically elected second president is now in office, the government now sees the Red Scare, or a moral imperative, to get involved in Guatemala. If they didn't get involved in 1944 to 1951 with Ubico and the October Revolution, what was the moral imperative of getting involved in 1950? Well, if it wasn't that in 1944, which was a candidate was worse than the current one, then it arguably had to be something else. And what was that something else? That something else was United Fruit. A quick cast of characters, both corporate and individual. We'll start with the corporate characters. The primary, United Fruit Company. It's been there since 1930, but now we're in the 1950s. You know it now as Chiquita Bananas. It had control over the port, or the control of the access to the port at Puerto Barrios It controlled the railroad. It had huge swaths of land. It got tax concessions, etc., from Ubico back in the 1940s. The other was the International Railways of Central America. It was owned by United Fruit. They purchased it. It ran from Guatemala City to Puerto Barrios, and United Fruit used it exclusively to ship its product throughout the country, and it controlled all the prices that it charged to the country of Guatemala. Now for the cast of individual characters quickly. You know John Foster Dulles. He was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. He was also the senior partner for Sullivan and Cromwell. And we'll get to him, that firm, again in a future episode regarding Central America as well. John Foster Dulles also worked for J. Henry Schroeder Banking Company. That was the key financial advisor to the International Railway of Central America, controlled by United Fruit, which owned most of Guatemala's train lines. Sullivan and Cromwell did work for United Fruit. Allen Dulles, you know him as director of CIA. He was on the board of Schroeder Banking Company. He held stock in IRCA. He was the president of Schroeder Bank, was also on the board of IRCA, and Schroeder Bank also handled secret CIA funds for covert operations. Eisenhower's personal secretary was the wife of United Fruit Company's PR director, Edmund Whitman. Ambassador to Costa Rica, Robert Hill, was close to United Fruit. He worked for Grace Shipping Lines, who had a financial interest in Guatemala, and he later became a director of Grace Shipping Lines. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and his family held stock in United Fruit Company, and he also spoke for United Fruit in the Senate and as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Juan Manuel Galvez was the president of Honduras, and he was also prior counsel to United Fruit Company. Walter Beadle Smith was a CIA director. Then they promoted him to undersecretary to John Foster Dulles. He was seeking a position with United Fruit. And United Fruit hired Edward Bernay as a director of public relations. And United Fruit also hired Thomas G. Cochran. He was Franklin Roosevelt's original brain truster, who he began to network with insiders in D.C. and CIA. He was also the attorney for the CIA front airline called Civil Air Transport Company, CAT. Then they became Air America. And so he also worked as a secret go-between in CIA plot for Operation Fortune, which was called off at the last moment. And the other person was E. Howard Hunt. He was working in the CIA, involved in this overthrow, coup d'etat of Arbenz in 1954. And what else was he involved in? Watergate. Okay, let's stop here for a moment. Now you see the cast of characters, both individually and corporate. And you've got a background of Guatemala, and you have a background of kind of how the United States government considered its conduct or its relationship with the Central American countries, South American countries at the time. You saw who and what Ubico was and like, and now you see this second person who was democratically elected all of a sudden becomes a problem. Why is he now all of a sudden a problem? That's the question. What's changed? What changed was Decree 900. When Arbenz was elected, he continued the reforms of his predecessor, including Decree 900, where holdings greater than 666 acres or more were subject to confiscation. Under what? The Guatemalan Constitution enacted in when? 1944, 7 years prior to him becoming the president. Now, he was actually enforcing what had been on the books since 1944. So who do you think this affected the most? The U.S. company holding the most land. And who was that? United Fruit. So now ask yourself, why the change? United Fruit went crying to the United States government because they're about to lose this land. The irony is, it was land they weren't even using. It was fallow. They were keeping the land in case they needed it because of some disease in the banana plants. But they weren't using the land. It was sitting, and it was the most desirable, arable land in Guatemala, and they had huge swaths of it. They were only using about 15% of the land in which they controlled. So the problem was that Arbenz wasn't a threat to them. He wasn't a Marxist. He wasn't a communist. Now, his wife might have had some socialist tendencies or was more of a socialist minded in Central America. Well, that wasn't unusual. It wasn't that Arbenz wasn't a known commodity. He was been around since 1944, so the United States government knew of him. The problem was now he was going to take the land of this corporation, which all of these individuals arguably had some sort of financial or political interest in, and United Fruit had political power also because of these ties in the United States government. That's when all this became extremely interesting. So what was United Fruit's solution? Think back to the last episode. What did the United States just get finished completing about a year and a half before this incident? They just finished a successful coup d'etat where? In Iran. And they picked up what? A bunch of oil interest. That success could be brought right here. But what they needed, what they didn't have there, what they wanted to have here, is Edward Bernay's, the father of public relations. What was Edward Bernay's job? Propaganda. The same type of propaganda he used in World War I with George Creel and Walter Lippmann in convincing the United States that they needed to enter into World War I, and that was his expertise. He was successful in World War I. He would be successful here. His job was to both convince the American public the need for intervention in Central and South America because the communists were infiltrating Guatemala through the current president, the Red Scare. He was very successful at doing it. He was also working to subvert the loyalty of the military and convince the unions in the country and rural workers and city dwellers that Arbenz was finished. They started a small-scale psychological harassment, then escalated. They had radio propaganda campaigns and leaflets to frighten the populace and foment violence. They started training 300 mercenaries and Guatemalan exiles to infiltrate Guatemala. Half of it was for sabotage and some fictitious spearhead invasion. And ultimately, it was culminating in an invasion from Honduras. Assassination was considered, just like it was in Iran, but discarded to avoid making Arbenz a martyr. They tried to bribe Arbenz, but it wasn't successful. So they figured they needed a coup d'etat. So they used the Nicaraguan for assistance. That was the dictator was Somoza, and they used that for a base of flight operations and training. The CIA created a dummy arms company and began shipping Soviet-style arms to Panama, in the Canal Zone, and smuggled them into Guatemala for the use for the quote-unquote fake Soviet takeover. They created a nonprofit medical assistance in order to purchase airplanes to send the airplanes into Guatemala. These were World War II aircraft, without looking like they're sending the aircraft. The politicians went to work. John Foster Dulles pushed the Caracas Declaration of Solidarity in 1954, basically the resolution adopted in March of that year. We had used a Monroe Doctrine, but that didn't sell well with the Central and South American countries, so they saw that as U.S. imperialism. So what they wanted to do was to propose to condemn Guatemala and set the stage for upcoming actions, claiming they were being infiltrated by communists. Despite Arbenz's efforts to convince people, his own and the world otherwise, PB's success was a success. And the United States and CIA and, by proxy, United Fruit Company got its way. Another president was installed, and guess what? United Fruit got to keep his property, and all was well, so you think. The actions of the Eisenhower administration set the stage for a decade or longer civil war in Guatemala at the cost of 150,000 lives. So you say, Lewis, what's the point of all this information? The point is to think about propaganda. Our government's been using it at least from the turn of the 20th century. We saw it in World War I, we saw it in World War II, we saw it used in a coup d'etat in Iran, and we've seen it used here in a coup d'etat in Guatemala in 1950. You say, well, Lewis, they're not doing it now. Think about what's going on presently today. Think about the internet and social media, and you say, well, this is different. It's more information. Think back in the day of Operation Desert Storm. If you don't believe it's still happening, research what firm was connected to Citizens for a Free Kuwait. It was a public relations astroturf firm, meaning Citizens for Free Kuwait wasn't really a grassroots organization, because it wasn't. It was established by the Kuwaiti government. And the testimony of this Naira to a Congressional Human Rights Caucus about some atrocities that were happening in Kuwait, essentially children would be taken off out of the incubators, which was shared to use to convince the Americans, to convince America to enter the Persian Gulf in Operation Desert Storm. This testimony was proven false, and that she actually was the daughter of a Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. The principal firm associated with the Citizens for Free Kuwait was Hill & Knowlton. It was a worldwide, public relations firm It was part of WPP PLC, a British multinational communications, advertising, and public relations firm. It was the world's largest advertising company as of 2023. So do we see this type of PR, this public relations, this propaganda continuing? Of course you do. The point of this whole episode is to recognize that when they want to make something look like something, they know how to do it. If you ever get a chance, read the first 4 chapters of the book called The Nudge. It's by a guy named John Thaler and Cass Sunstein. Just the first 4 chapters. It talks about how they get people to make choices. So just recognize that propaganda is around us all the time. Decisions you're made through marketing and public relations, all of that is manipulated by individuals who know how to make you choose. You see it all the time in your feeds on social media. It is around us all the time. So when they want to create a narrative, they know exactly how to do it, and they're very good at it and have been doing it for at least a century. You know, when you get on the internet, on your social media feed, you're seeing propaganda all the time. They're getting you to choose what they want and listen to their narrative, so you'll make a response that they want you to have. It's out there. We need to recognize it for what it is. Now think about Operation Desert Storm again. Think about the consequences of that, those flat-out untruths. Think about what's going on presently. Think about Ukraine, Palestine, Israel. Think about Somalia. Think about the places where we've been involved in and ask yourself, do you think that possibly some of that was propaganda? Rightly, wrongly, I don't know. But that's a question we need to continually ask ourselves, because the decisions that we make as a country impact not only on us, but on the lives of other people. So we need to be concerned that our government is acting in the best interest of us, not convincing us to do something that they want us to do. So next time you're on the internet and you're reading or looking at things that are passing through your feed, or you happen to be watching some news channel you're watching, paper you're reading, or an article you're reading, ask yourself, what message are they trying to get you to buy into? Because all media has a point, and the point is to get a point across to you. So what narrative are they pushing? What emotional tie are they trying to reach? What are they trying to get you to think? Now, it's unfortunate we have to be at this place, but history tells us one thing, that when things are going on around the world and our government is getting involved, it's important for us to understand, as the sovereigns of this country, why we're getting involved, and for the right reasons, not for reasons that people make up. As in Guatemala and Arben's case, they made him out to be something he wasn't, and it wasn't for almost 40 years later, after his death, that apologies were made and restitution was made for what they inappropriately did at that period of time. But it was too late for him or his family or the country or the people that lost their lives. The next time people want you to respond or put a flag on your social media post, ask yourself why, and then think as you read and not necessarily emote. Because sometimes there's unintended consequences to our actions, as here. Observing the actions unfolding was an Argentinian-born visitor who just happened to be in Guatemala. He witnessed the coup d'etat, and it made an impact and a nudge. He left and went to Mexico to meet with 2 brothers who were exiled there. His name was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, but you likely know him as Che. I'll leave the lights on for you. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. You know, the more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward, because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving it that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.